All right, you guys, so we are going to be doing a little bit of analysis. So today Magnus Carlsen was playing against none other than the famed streamer, the chess bra Eric Hansen himself, in the 6th round of the Oslo Esports Cup. Now, of course, in one of the previous events, Eric won a very memorable game with Magnus mouse slipping, losing a queen in an already much worse position. So today obviously was going to be the chance for Magnus to come back and beat Eric. All right, let's get going. First game, we have d4 being played. Knight f6 here. c4, e6, or not e6, g6 played by Eric. Knight c3 and d5. Now, one thing that I thought was really impressive by Eric, and something that I think he probably picked up from me actually when he played his first event, was that in his first event that he played in online, he kept it very straightforward. And when everybody was playing e4 against him, every single game he just played this variation of the Spanish, which was the Chigorin with castles, bishop e7, rook e1, b5, bishop b3. I think he was playing the d6 order, c3, castles, h3, knight e5, bishop c2, c5, d4, etc, etc. But he kept a very tight repertoire with very limited opening choices, and I thought that was very impressive. And of course, Magnus, after that game, decides in this one to not play e4. So we get the Grunfeld defense played by Eric. Now Eric has played it a lot in online chess, so not really much of a surprise. So we get takes, knight takes, e4, all very standard. Oh, and looky Magnus decides to take a page out of the playbook of Grandmaster Hikaru Nakamura by playing queen a4 check. Now, for everybody who is not familiar with queen a4, Hikaru has played this in many matches against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, the famous French grandmaster, both in the chess.com speed championship. He also played it in a tiebreaker in Gibraltar some years back, so it is something that Grandmaster Hikaru has played a lot. So again, Magnus in this tournament seems to be emulating Hikaru. He's playing knight f3, e3, b3 type systems, hyper modern stuff. Now he chooses to play queen a4 like Hikaru, so pretty exciting. So we get c6 here, knight to f3, knight d7, bishop e2, castles, b5. Now it's worth noting, actually, you guys, I forgot there was one game. The earliest memory when I played queen a4 is actually pretty memorable. It was against Alexander Grishuk. It was in the FIDE Grand Prix, I believe, in Khanty-Mansiysk in Siberia in 2015. And in that event, I did actually tie for first place. And through that FIDE Grand Prix event in 2015, I did qualify for the 2016 Candidates Chess Tournament. All right. So we get b5 being played here. Queen c2, knight to b6. Now the idea, I think, behind playing c6 and b5 here is pretty straightforward. Much like some of the games that I've played, black is trying to grip the center here, get a grip on c4, maybe f5 at some point. So I just play some random moves. You can get a really nice light square bind on d5 and c4 here, with the pawns on b5 and c6, and the knight potentially jumping to c4 or d5. So you want to kind of try to grip the center a little bit if you can. So bishop f4 is played here. Now, unfortunately for black, f5 is way too committal here, because if you play f5, I think there are a couple of ways. But first of all, you cede the e5 square. Additionally, maybe white has something like knight g5 followed by like a queen b3, and it's a little bit too loose, so you can't quite grip the center. So we get bishop g4 played here. Now, on top of ideas like f5, black also has another idea, which is to play b4 and at some point undermine the central pawns here. If you can trade the bishop on f3, say I make again some random moves, maybe at some point you have an idea like b4, and after takes, bishop takes, or even queen takes, you activate the queen, and white's center is not as good as it was before. Now again, in this specific position, it's still better for white, but it is one of the themes that does exist here. So here bishop g4 is played. Magnus goes knight e5. Eric trades on e2, of course, and now he plays bishop takes e5. Now this, I think, is a situation of the difference between a classical game of chess and a rapid / blitz game. In a classical game, I think taking on e5 here is very logical. If you use your time, you realize that you get a great bastion here, and after queen a5, it seems that black should have enough pressure on the queen side here. c3 and d4 weak, maybe f5 at some point, maybe c5 somewhere, and black is fine. Now what I suspect happens here is that because this is a rapid game, while I think the black is objectively okay here, probably white starts to build some pressure, create some attacks, and black simply can't react to them because he has to move quicker and can't find the right defensive setup. So rook a1 is played, f6 played by Eric. Now I really don't like f6 here. My instinct is that in this position you probably need to do something fast. I don't know if it's c5 or b4 on the queen side, or maybe it's just a strike hard, strike first, and strike in the center with e5, but it feels like you need to do something here. So f6 is played. Now the problem with f6 is that now you actually give up all the dark squares. White can play h4, h5, even queen g4, queen e6, and it feels very iffy on the king side for black here. So we get h4, Rook a d8 played, and now rook f d1 played by Magnus. Not the best move, by the way. Computer just likes bishop h6, rook f7, and then h5, and you just go full on caveman mode. And after e5 trade, queen g4, king h7, queen h4, king g8. Now you can go f4, and you follow it up by lifting your rook to h3 and just checkmating on the h file here. Now again, once you see it with a computer, it's obviously very thematic and very easy. But when you're playing a quick game and you don't really see the win right away, it's very easy to get concerned because you see black maybe has rook h7, some pins on the h file. Your center is a little bit brittle here, so if you don't see f4, rook f3, you're maybe not even better. So in this position, Magnus plays rook f d1, which is a very logical move. We get e5 here, bishop h6, rook f e8, and now queen g4. And after queen c7, computer actually thinks that white is not better anymore because now the center is kind of closed here. If white ever trades on e5, you can take with the knight or the pawn. Additionally, queen is going to f7, and the black king on g8 is very safe. So for example, after h5, queen f7, black is solid like a rock here on the king side, and now there's a lot of pressure and tension on the d and the e files, and black's rooks are perfectly placed on d8 and e8. So what did Magnus do here? He goes rook d3, queen d7 played by Hansen, obviously trying to trade the queens. If queens come off the board here, your bishop on h6 just looks really silly. You have no way to actually attack the black king, even though you control all these dark squares around the king. So we get queen to g3 played here, queen e6 played by Eric, rook e1, rook d7, and now Magnus gets f4. And Eric, because he waited, I think, just a little bit too long here, now Magnus is able to start opening up the king side a little bit more, and there's a lot of pressure. I think if we go back to this position, my instinct is that queen e6 is wrong. I don't know what the best move is. I guess okay, computer says a5. I also like maybe just queen f7 here, maybe to play f5 potentially. But I feel like after queen e6, rook e1, rook d7, f4, now it gets kind of tricky to play because now with the bishop on h6, f file is opening up. There always will be mate ideas on the f file here. There's still h5, and you're not really doing anything on the queen side. And once you trade on f4, for example, now white center here is extremely solid from c3, d4, and e4. So Eric goes king h8 here, which is a big mistake. So now f takes e5, f takes e5, rook f1, and just like that, white is going to be able to line up the double stack and crush you on these dark squares, g7 and f8. Bishop on h6 is a dream. Maybe even you line up the legendary triple stack, and meanwhile you have nothing happening on the queen side and nothing really happening in the center, so you're just positionally lost. So we get rook f7, trade, rook f3, queen e7, h5 played by Magnus, and what to say, you're just basically lost. If you take on h5, I can go bishop to g5 here, and after queen g7, I go bishop f6, and you politely resign the game here. If you go, let's just say queen d7, again, nothing really changes, or queen e6, I just go bishop f6 check. King cannot move because queen captures the king, and after queen takes, rook takes, white very simply wins the game here. So in this position, Eric plays queen d6, and now Magnus goes queen f2, lining up the double stack here. And it's just over. After gh5, bishop g5 here, Eric resigns. I think even rook f6 here is probably crushing. Everything is just collapsing for black in this position. But after bishop g5, he resigns in view of the fact that white's threatening bishop f6. So say you play a move like a5, I go check, king g8. Now I can go queen g3 check. And after king f7, I have bishop d8 check, king e6, and queen h3 checkmate. King has no squares. Bishop takes e5 also, of course, would just win the game as well. And if you play a move like h6, or not a5, say you play a move like h6, bishop f6, king h7, you dodge the checks on the g file here. But again, after white plays a move like rook g3 followed by queen f5 or rook g7, it's very simply lost for black. So therefore, in this position, after bishop g5, Eric Hansen resigns against Magnus, and Magnus wins what looks like a very clean positional masterpiece. Now, it's not a clean positional masterpiece objectively because black was okay, but it really shows how when you're playing a rapid and blitz game in particular, if you're not super precise, you get careless for like 2 to 3 moves, just like that, after f4 and f takes e5, everything is gone. So it could have been Eric had chances maybe to equalize, but he didn't understand the danger, and probably he was low on time already, so it became too difficult to play. At any rate, Magnus wins a nice game. So let's move on to the second game. So now we have Eric playing with the white piece against Magnus, and of course Eric opens with his classic e4, c5, knight f3, e6, and now Eric plays g3. Now one thing that's actually kind of interesting about Eric playing g3 is that I have been on the white side of this many times against Eric. Eric actually plays the Kahn and the Paulson systems against me all the time in online blitz, at least when he used to play a lot. And so it's kind of interesting that he chooses to play g3, because even when I played him, I don't recall him playing g3. He almost always is somebody who likes to play just a straight open and be very aggressive. So I don't actually like this decision to play g3 here and sort of play something a little bit slow. So we get d5, takes, bishop g2, knight c6, castles, knight f6, all pretty standard. d4, bishop e7, we get takes, knight c3, castles, bishop g5, bishop e6. Now I may be crazy, but I could have sworn that this position is a game that I had actually, where I had the black pieces against Luke McShane in the London Chess Classic. Let me see if I can find it. Let me see if I can find the game. I could have sworn that knight d2 is what I had. I had the black pieces. Let me open ChessBase on my other monitor. Give me 1 second. Let me see if I can find it. I could have sworn that I had this exact position against Luke McShane. I'm just making all the theory. Well, I just want to see if my memory is correct here, because I don't know if Luke played knight d2 or knight e1, but I'm pretty sure I had this exact position. So let me just open ChessBase. Give me 1 second. Online database. 1 second. Give me 1 second, you guys. Takes, bishop g2, castles, knight c6, d4, b7, takes, knight c3, castles, bishop g5, bishop e6, and Elo White, you guys. And in the London Chess Classic in 2011, in this position, Luke McShane played the move rook b1. Now, as I was saying, this all looks very familiar, and it's been a very long time since I looked at this line. But I do recall knight d2, knight e1 being moved. But Luke played rook b1. The game would go on to be a draw. But this is something that I am fairly familiar with. Once again, this was a game that was played over 11 years ago, so a very, very long time. But at any rate, it's what it is. Okay, so we get knight to d2 being played here. Bishop d4 played, knight to b3, trade, and now h6. Now, already in this position, I think you could say that it's pretty safe to say that black is equalized, because when we look at this position right here, the one advantage that white has potentially is that black has an isolated pawn on d5. However, when we look at this position after h6 and bishop e3, rook c8, while black has the isolated pawn, it's very well guarded here by the bishop and the knight and the queen, and white also has these double isolated pawns on c2 and c3 here. So now we get a4, Magnus goes rook e8, h3, logical move to stop knight g4, knight to e4 played here, Eric goes bishop d4, and now Magnus plays bishop f5. And I think at this point it's very clearly better for black. I don't know if I would say this is winning. Obviously the bar gives black a big advantage, but black is doing great. This pawn on d5 is not a weakness, it's actually a strength, because it supports the knight on e4. Additionally, the pawns on c2 and c3 are very weak. So Magnus is having the time of his life here. So you get rook e1, knight takes d4, c takes d4, and while black has undoubled the pawns, now white has pawns on d4 and c2. Now this backwards pawn on c2 becomes a big target from both the bishop on f5 and the rook on c8. So knight c3 is played here. We get queen d2, rook e1, knight takes a4. Now apparently this is a mistake. Computer actually just thinks knight e4 is a better move, because after queen d1 you can just play something like knight f6, and basically you're playing against the two weaknesses on a4 and c2, like something like rook e2, just b6 followed by queen c7, no knight c5 here because the pawn stops it, or knight a5, and so black should be quite a bit better here. So interesting idea. Now of course rapid blitz game can't be too harsh, but knight takes a4 of course also makes a lot of sense. So you get knight takes a4, queen b4, knight b6, but now white gets knight c5, and while black is up a pawn here, both these pawns on a7 and b7 can be attacked quite easily. Also, white has a nice outpost with this knight on c5, and this d5 pawn is potentially a little bit weak. So now we get bishop takes c2, knight takes b7, queen f6, knight c5 of course, and the idea is just to go rook a1 and go after the pawn on a7. Magnus plays bishop f5, and now we get rook e5, king h7, bishop f1. Now I feel like already here, I guess you can't go queen a5 or queen a3 because of knight c4, but it feels like white is very close to equalizing. So bishop f1 makes sense. Bishop g6, not a move like rook c7 because then you would lose the game. Rook takes bishop, queen takes, and bishop d3, GG's, game over. Magnus would have to resign, and we get another epic moment. Instead he goes bishop g6, h4, nice move to play h5. Magnus plays rook takes c5 here, basically admitting that at this point he doesn't feel like he can play on with pawn to h5. I'm guessing he probably was worried about something like bishop e2, worried that the pawn is weak on h5. all of these pawns on a7, d5, and h5 are very weak, and white has great outposts here for the rook on e5 and the knight on c5 from the pawn. So with the 3 pawn weaknesses, Magnus chooses not to do this. Instead, he says, you know what, I'm going to simplify here, and I'm going to make the draw and avoid any danger. He plays rook takes c5, queen takes c5, and now he goes knight d7, creating a fork towards the queen on c5 and the knight and the rook on e5. And now we get queen takes pawn, and now we get knight takes rook, pawn takes, and queen b6. And apparently this is actually a blunder. The bar actually goes way up. Oh, apparently h5. Oh, did Magnus blunder here? Apparently he should have gone queen f5, and we just reach a standard position with queen, bishop, and 4. And basically what should happen here is white will end up winning the a7 pawn in return for the e5 pawn, and then we'll be left with an endgame where both sides just have these 3 pawns, and it should be a very peaceful draw. Magnus, however, plays queen b6, and Eric misses an idea by going bishop d3. Apparently he should have played h5, and the idea is that if you play bishop takes h5, you can now go e6, creating the fossil. And now if black was something like bishop g6, you go e7, and as Yasser Seirawan would say, push baby push, because now after something like f6, white just goes bishop, I think d3 or c4, not sure which one, but both these moves should just be winning for white here, because now you're going to trade the bishops, say queen b8, takes queen d8, queen b1, king h2, you make a queen, and that's all she wrote. However, a computer, I guess you guys are saying, what is the draw here? Bishop f5 and queen e6, and maybe this is a draw, but I don't know exactly what. But this was a chance that Eric missed. Instead, at this point, he concedes, he sort of resigns himself to the fact that he's just going to make the draw by going bishop d3, and now we reach a queen upon endgame. And if anybody has to be careful here, it probably is white, because black does have the outside pass pawn that can just run right down the board very, very quickly here. So queen d7, queen b1, king g2, queen e4, king g1, and then we get a bunch of repetitions here. Queen e8 played by Magnus, trying to put the queen behind the pass pawn to rumble it down the board. So you go f4, a5, f5 played by Eric. Very good understanding that he realizes that because his pawn is going down the board so fast, you got to create your own pass pawn and create the counterplay to save the game. So queen f3 is played here. Now we get e6 takes, king f1 check here. And again, basically we get this repetition. And one thing that I said yesterday, or maybe it was 2 days ago, when we looked at the games between Magnus and Pragnananta, is that in a queen and pawn endgame, if you could get a queen and a pawn going down the board, nothing else matters. As long as your opponent doesn't have pawns that are going to reach the end of the board before you, if you get a queen and a pawn like this, you'll always be able to save the game, because it's just a queen that's checking you here. So you get queen f3, king 1, and a draw is agreed, because after takes, let's just say black was check. Even if black could somehow go a4 here, you just go e7, and you're threatening to make a queen, and there's no way to stop the queen and the pawn. So therefore Magnus has to resign himself to the draw in this position. And yeah, so very sort of interesting game. I would say once again it felt like Magnus had the chances if anyone did, but it was a very peaceful result. So once again, this is obviously a 4-game match. So after 2 games, the result is 1.5 in favor for Magnus. So let's go to game 3. So Magnus with the white pieces plays d4, knight f6, c4, and Eric changes it up. He chooses not to play g6 in the Grunfeld. Instead, he plays e6 here. So you get knight f3, d5, knight c3. Now Eric plays c5. So Eric chooses to play the semi-trash variation of the Queen's Gambit Decline. This has become very popular in the games between Pragnananta and Magnus the other day. This was featured in quite a few of those games. So now we get cd5, knight d5, e4 played here, knight takes c3, pawn takes, trade, bishop b4, all very standard so far. Bishop d2, trade, castles. And the main idea behind this setup here is that white has the pawns in the center, black has maybe a majority on the queen side long term, but at the end of the day there are very few pieces on the board here. So black tries to argue that he'll be able to stop the pawns in the center, and long term, if there are exchanges, he'll be able to create an outside pass pawn and maybe win the game. So we get rook c1, b6, bishop d3 here, bishop b7, all pretty normal, castles, knight d7, queen f4 played here by Magnus. Now we get h6. Now this whole semi-trash variation, it was popularized by Vladimir Kramnik, the strong former world chess champion from Russia. He played it a lot and proved that it's quite playable. He himself had a lot of memorable matchups in this opening against Magnus himself. So we get h4 played here by Magnus. Now, I don't like h6 here. Again, it's kind of a little bit it feels a little bit iffy, kind of, if I had to look at this. Now what I'm trying to remember is, you know, one thing that I remember is actually, if we go back to 2019 in the second to last round of the United States Chess Championship, I actually had this exact position against Lenny Dominguez, and in that game I played this move queen to e3 instead of this castles like Magnus did. Now generally what happens here is you're looking for various setups, whether it's queen f4, h4, queen e3. You're looking for setups to put the queen somewhere where you can eventually open up the center of the board with a move like e5 or d5. So we get h4 played here, knight to f6, and now we get pawn to d5 played by Magnus. Very thematic idea. Now this is an idea that originally I believe was found by Michael Tal. I could be wrong on this, but I think that some of the initial ideas in this line, it wasn't from this order. It was I think it was in something like, I'm trying to remember the exact position, I can't remember for the life of me, but there's some line where basically someone will be able to tell me this in chat. There's some position where basically you go d5 takes an e5 with more pieces on the board, and white tries to put a lot of pressure on the diagonals from d3 to h7 and potentially bishop g5 or knight g5 here. So it doesn't, the original idea doesn't exist from this line, but a similar variation. So it is a common theme that what you do here is you give up a pawn and you close the diagonal for the bishop, and you're going to go knight d4, maybe knight f5, and attack on the king side here. So now we get knight e4, knight to d4 played by Magnus. Great understanding. Bishop is on a dead diagonal. You're going for knight f5 to put a lot of pressure on g7 and h6. So now we get bishop c8 played by Eric, which I think is a bad move. By playing bishop c8, what Eric is really hoping for here is he's thinking that, well, you know, Magnus, he's just his GM. They'll probably see that he's down a pawn here. He's going to exchange the bishop for the knight, recoup the pawn. But if white does this after a move like bishop d7 and rook c8, black is actually completely fine because white has these weak pawns on e5 and h4, and black has rook c8 here. And again, even rook e8 and black has no issues. However, Magnus, being the world champion, understands that he does not actually want to simplify the position here. He chooses to play rook to c6, and now after bishop d7, which is played by Eric, now he takes on e4, and after takes he goes rook d6. Beautiful concept here to activate this rook. If we go back to this position right here, let's say you take and bishop d7, black is completely fine. I'll go rook c8. Maybe you can put the rook on d1, but the rook on d1 here is not super effective on a mostly closed d file, whereas in the game, once you go rook c6 takes and rook d6, the rook is amazing here. It's targeting the pawn on h6. Pawn supports the rook. There's a pin on the d file, so rook on d6 is much better than the rook on d1, because also the knight is now still perfectly positioned to go to c6 or f5, whereas if you look at the position before, now you're gonna have to move the knight in this position. You'll have to like move a knight out to get the rook to d6. So therefore you basically magically take the rook and you put it on the best possible square on the d file without having to move the knight out of the way. So now after rook d6, queen e7, we get rook e1 here, and white can even line up the double stack. So his rook on d6 is a big thorn in black's side here. Rook e1, rook a c8 played here, rook takes e4 played by Magnus. We get rook c3. And the idea behind rook c3 is quite simple. What white would love to do here is that, let's just say I play some random garbage moves, a5, rook e3, b5. I'd love to get like rook g3 here. And now there are a lot of problems here. The queen and the rook are targeting h6. The rook on g3 targets the pawn on g7. And black is in a lot of trouble here. So now we get rook to c3. King to h2 played by Magnus. Rook e8. Trying to put pressure on the pawn on e5. So thus far, it feels like Eric is kind of hanging in, but it's still very tough to play. We get knight e2 here, and now rook c6. Now, to me, I feel like rook c5 is the obvious move. Of course, you guys, a computer on a weak, or a computer, the chess.com version of Stockfish, which is significantly weaker than Strongish Engine, says, oh yeah, just who cares? Go rook a3. And don't see any danger here after knight g3. You figure, okay, whatever, just go b5, and after knight h5 here, you can just go bishop e6, and somehow white has no attack here on the king side. But for us humans, especially in a blitz game, to see this knight going to h5, this g7 threat, f6 threat, you're definitely going to get very scared. And so no human is going to go rook a3 here and just ignore the raging potential attack on the king side. Computers, of course, will just ignore it, laugh at your face, and prove that you don't know anything about chess. So Eric plays rook c6, very logical human move. Knight g3 played by Magnus, with the idea again, knight is on a good square, guards the rook on e4 if you trade. Now the knight protects the rook, and you also have the ideas like h5 and f5 still. So here Eric trades and goes queen d8. Very, very sensible idea, but the only problem now is after rook c4, white has a protected pass pawn on d6, and now with the rook on c7, we're also going to end up with another right triangle here, and black is probably in some serious danger now. Again, how does this happen? Because black doesn't really sense the danger and thinks, you know what, I simplify and I'm actually completely fine, when in reality the simplification here gives white a protected pass pawn, and now there are all sorts of problems for black to deal with. So now rook e6 is played, and now Magnus goes knight f5, because now you no longer can capture the knight since the rook's in the way of the bishop, and now it's going downhill pretty fast. So you get king h8, knight e7 played by Magnus, and now the diagonal is closed. Knight on e7 protected by the pawn. Now there are ideas like rook c8, and the f7 pawn is weak, and the knight can even go to g6 maybe if you push f6 at some point, and it feels pretty tough to play. Eric goes rook f6, queen to d4, centralizing the queen. Again, perfect positioning. Guards the pawns on f2, h4, and d6, creating the classic sunray, as XQC would say, and now white is probably clearly winning. a5 is played here. King to g1 played by Magnus. Interesting move, by the way. Now my assumption behind king g1, why did Magnus go king g1 here? My guess is he just figured, you know what, black can't do a whole lot. Like, black can't really move the bishop. If you move, you lose to rook c8. If you go bishop e6, I have rook c6. And so my assumption is Magnus figured, you know what, g3 isn't the move I want to play because f2 is still weak. But if I go king g1 here, I dodge any checks on this diagonal towards h2, and I can still follow up with ideas like rook c7 later on, and nothing, there's really nothing happening. Black doesn't have any good moves. So you get rook to e6, rook to c3 played by Magnus, now bishop to e8 played by Eric, finally sort of cracking under the pressure and making a blunder. Computer thinks after queen f6, rook g3, you can go the very strange move rook to f6, and you're still kind of hanging in there. I mean, you're still in trouble, but computer thinks black can hang in. So instead, Eric finally cracks and he plays this move bishop to e8 here, and now you get rook to g3, rook f6, and now knight f5, and now you lose the game. Now the difference, of course, is that in this position after queen b8, rook g3, rook f6, there is no knight f5 because your bishop on d7 covers the square. So once you see the idea, very obvious, but Magnus, as always, does not miss. Finds knight f5 here. You cannot take the knight because then you get checkmated in one by the queen and the rook here. And after you go g6, knight e7 pack, queen takes d6, and knight d5. Brilliant move, brilliant sequence by Magnus. Again, you don't really have anything better on this diagonal. If you go king g7, same problem, knight d5, pinning the tail on the donkey. And after queen d6, same thing, knight d5 played here. King to g7, rook to d3 played by Magnus. Another very precise move, by the way, because if you do take on f6 right away, black can maybe hope to survive with something like b5 and a4 here, and you put the bishop on d7 and you go like king e7, and maybe here black can actually save the game and make a draw. But again, as we see, Magnus is very unforgiving. He doesn't do that. Instead, he goes rook d3 in one go, because now you can also move the queen back on the diagonal. Say I go b5, you can move the queen back and just keep this pin alive, and you have great chances to win. Additionally, there's the problem that now if you play like a move like a4, I can trade, and very simply I can go rook d6 check and collect one of your pawns on the queen side by winning the pawn on b6, and this should be a very easy technical win. So after rook d3, we get b5 played by Eric, again trying to save the two queenside pawns for when this exchange occurs on f6. Magnus goes g4 here. So brutal. Idea is just simply g5. You can't move your king because you lose your rook, and if you move the bishop here, I just go g5 and I collect the rook with the pawn. So he plays g5, of course, to stop that, and now we get f4, and here Eric resigns. Again, absolutely brutal finish. If you take either pawn, I go g5, I win the rook here. h4, same thing. Also, it's worth noting here, you can't go queen g3 because the rook covers that square. And again, if you don't do anything, you go bishop c6, same thing. I just take and I win your rook. And if you go king g6, which is the only other move, there are many ways to win here. Probably the easiest one is to go check, king g7, takes, takes, and now I think h6 is simply an easy win here. If you take, you just lose the rook. You go king g6. There again many ways to win. Probably simplest is just queen e4, king h6, rook h3 check, king g7 check, and then queen h8 checkmate. King has no squares because the knight on d5 covers e7. So very, very rough finish here after f4. Eric resigns the game and Magnus wins the match very convincingly by a score of 2.5 to half. 2 wins and 1 draw in 3 games. Again, much like his match against Pragnananta, Magnus out for blood, very motivated to show Eric who the boss is, and really just gives Eric no chance in this match. So very, very tough. But again, for Magnus, showing his class and a very impressive result. So Magnus wins this match 2.5 half after a little bit of a hiccup against Jordan Van Forest yesterday, but still looking very likely to win the Oslo Esports Cup. All right,